Well, let me officially welcome you to the webinar today on the topic of Fast Track to Wi-Fi Security. We're going to be going over some of the security solutions that are used in wireless networks today and some that shouldn't be, covering both deprecated solutions and modern solutions that are still in use. So we will be talking about the basics of security and also giving you some information on some of the newer security enhancements that the 802.11 standard has introduced recently and how we might see those utilized in the future. Before we get into the main topics of the presentation today, just a quick reminder that CWNP offers career certifications in enterprise Wi-Fi technologies from beginner to expert. Not pictured here is the CWTS certification, which is an entry-level certification that's great for people wanting to get started in their knowledge of Wi-Fi and covers the basics of RF, wireless hardware, and wireless operations. The foundation of the multi-certification track is the CWNA certification. This certification actually provides the foundation of knowledge that is required to understand security, design, and analysis effectively for wireless networks. And it is a 5-day class or a 4-day class, depending on the training center where you attended if you decide to take the class. And of course, self-paced learning is also an option. Now we have 3 professional level certifications in security, design, and analysis or troubleshooting. And these are focused on these particular 3 areas. All 4 of these, the CWNA, CWSP, CWDP, and CWAP, are exam-based certifications, and the CWTS is as well. The CWNE, the Certified Wireless Expert, is not an exam-based certification, but rather it requires that you've passed the other 4 listed here on the screen and that you submit an application, which is processed by the Board of Advisors. They will look at the application and validate your qualifications to become a certified wireless network expert. More information about all of these certifications can always be found by going to cwnp.com and clicking on certifications in the navigation menu. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the evolution of Wi-Fi security. So 802.11 as a standard was first ratified in 1997, sometimes called 802.11 Prime, and of course today here we are in 2016. And when we look at the history of security with 802.11 Prime, we basically had WEP. Now WEP was an implementation of the RC4 encryption cipher, and it had several weaknesses that caused problems in it, keeping us from being able to use it long term. There were proprietary solutions that came along between 1997 and 2004 to address some of the weaknesses in WEP. These included vendor-specific encryption solutions as well as just the use of virtual private network or VPN connections in order to secure the link. Then in 2004, 802.11i was ratified as a draft to the 802.11 amendment. And it introduced TKIP with RC4 WPA as a transitional solution, and also CCMP AES. So it introduced new security solutions to enhance the actual solutions within the protocol suite. It was implemented over time, first of all WPA with TKIP and RC4, not TC4, and then eventually as the hardware caught up and we had powerful enough processors to run the AES encryption, we saw the implementation of WPA2, which is CCMP AES. A lot of acronyms, we'll talk about them a little bit more as we go along. So CCMP AES was also introduced in the 2004 amendment to the standard. And then after that was when we started to get some good security solutions, monitoring became a big issue as well. So this was the ability to evaluate what's going on the network and in the coverage space and determine if there are, for example, rogue access points, if there are devices using older security solutions that shouldn't be used, things like this. Monitoring solutions, sometimes called intrusion prevention systems, were implemented in order to monitor the security and report any incidents or problems that were discovered. And of course, preventative solutions followed along very quickly. So at first we had IDS, which basically could detect something and alert you to that. And then we had IPS, which could not only detect it, but possibly take preventative action as well. Now, as we look forward into the future, the GCMP security solution is implemented in the 802.11 standard, and we'll talk more about that later. But this gives us an enhancement over CCMP AES, primarily in the area of processing efficiency. So when it comes to security then, the reality is the weak link breaks the chain. That is to say that if you have implemented WPA2 and 802.1x EAP in large portions of the network, but there are certain areas where you're allowing WEP or even WPA, then you can run into problems where in those weak areas of the network, attackers can take advantage of that and potentially gain access to your network. So the weak link breaks the chain. And what we want to do is move as quickly away from all of these older, now deprecated solutions, or really things that people used as security solutions that really weren't security solutions in the first place, like SSID hiding and MAC filtering. So if we can move away from these and cease to use them, then we're going to be better off. But in many cases, that does mean replacement of hardware. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So we need to get away from the weak links and only have the strong links, which today is WPA2, 802.1x EAP. These are the strong security solutions that we have today. So let's talk first of all then about deprecated solutions. And we're talking here about what, according to the actual 802.11 standard, is deprecated. And I have here some quick screen grabs of text directly from the 802.11 2012 standard. First of all, in the definitions at the very beginning of the standards document, we have a definition for wired equivalent privacy, or WEP. And the definition simply states it's a deprecated cryptographic data confidentiality algorithm specified by this standard. So sure, it's specified here in the standard, but it's deprecated. It shouldn't be used anymore. Another section of the standard says the use of WEP for confidentiality, authentication, or access control is deprecated. And then very specifically, the WEP algorithm is unsuitable for the purposes of this standard. And not only that, it goes on in the very next sentence and says the use of TKIP is deprecated. The TKIP algorithm is unsuitable for the purposes of this standard. So TKIP is the temporal key integrity protocol, and it was kind of the stopgap that 802.11i introduced all the way back in 2004 in order to give you transition over to GCMP with AES. And the reason for it was that many of the devices that were out at the time simply could not be upgraded through software alone, firmware upgrades, for example, in order to implement GCMP AES because they didn't have the processing power to do it. And so instead, a stopgap solution of what you might call an enhanced or repaired WEP was implemented, which was TKIP. And it still used the RC4 encryption cipher, but it fixed some of the key management problems with WEP. Well, that's not the last statement. The standard also says, except for open system authentication, all pre-RSNA security mechanisms have been deprecated as they fail to meet their security goals. New implementation should support pre-RSNA methods only to aid migration to RSNA methods. So here's the question I have for you. If you still have some devices, maybe some barcode scanners or something like that, that require WPA, TKIP RC4, right, or WEP, what is your transition plan? Because if we're going to abide by the standard and have a standards-based implementation, our implementation is going to only support those for a while, meaning we have a plan. We've got a migration plan to move over to GCMP AES or WPA2. We should not be implementing any of these deprecated technologies unless we have a migration plan away from them. So deprecated Wi-Fi security solutions like WEP, shared key, WPA should not be in your future plans. We have to do something to get away from it. So what I've said here is hashtag replace devices, because that's ultimately what we'll have to do if we've got some of those older devices that are driving us to continue using either WEP, which would be horrific, but possibly still there in some areas, or WPA. So we have to look at a plan to replace those devices so we can have a more secure environment. This is not anything new. This has been around for years when it comes to upgrading systems in general. You go all the way back to the 1990s and DOS and Windows 3.1 and security vulnerabilities that were in Windows 3.1. Once Windows 3.1 was no longer being updated, then we didn't have some systems that had moved over to Windows 95 or Windows 98, right? And we had to ask, what is our migration plan to get those Windows 3.1 systems out of there? I remember in somewhere around 2000 or 2001, I went to do some work in a facility and they still had a Windows 3.1 system there. And the reason was simple. It drove a large cutting table, and that cutting table was nearly $250,000 to purchase. It was used to cut out the covers for seats for semi-trucks. And the table was very expensive. The system that drove it was Windows 3.1. The company they purchased it from was out of business. There was no way to upgrade really to Windows 9X or Windows NT workstation or anything like that. And so the question is, what's your migration plan to get away from that? Well, the answer there, being that it was a $250,000 investment, is as slow as possible, right? That's the real world. The real world is sometimes we have massive investments that we hoped to get a significant lifespan out of. And now here we are faced with security issues that make us want to move away from it. And sometimes we're balancing the risk with the cost of replacing all of that gear. And so I do understand that issue, but even with that issue, we need to be asking ourselves, what is the plan to move away? When can it happen? How can we be moving into a more secure environment? And then sometimes, depending on the type of environment it is, regardless of the cost, that sunk cost for old equipment may simply have to be an eaten cost, and we have to do new investments to move forward in order to do things like payment processing or whatever it happens to be within that space. So that's deprecated solutions. Well, then what are the modern solutions? Well, the modern solutions are those that have been introduced in 802.11i and later to the standard. So GCMP AES, which is also known as WPA2 Personal or WPA2 Enterprise. So when you see a system using these, it's using GCMP as the Authentication and Key Management Solution and AES as the Cipher Suite. Now GCMP also uses AES, but it's a different AKM, and it's new with 802.11ac. Now, technically speaking, GCMP was introduced in 802.11ad, which, don't let the letters fool you, even though D is later in the alphabet than C, 802.11ad was ratified before 802.11ac. So, because 802.11ad specifies GCMP, it can be used in all of those devices. They work in a completely different frequency band. There's no backward compatibility concerns. And so two GCMP, or rather two 802.11ad devices talking to each other, can use GCMP. The problem comes with the fact that 11ac also supports GCMP, but it has to be backwardly compatible with 11n devices and other 11ac devices for that matter that do not support GCMP. So for that reason, we haven't seen a massive influx of GCMP being used in our environments yet. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Other monitoring solutions include, or other solutions that are modern include monitoring solutions that can be either integrated or overlay, and we'll talk about that more too. So GCMP AES, or WPA2, and GCMP are the modern solutions for Wi-Fi security. This doesn't mean we can use them in every scenario, but it's what we want to move toward today. So let's talk, though, about two security perspectives that are important to keep in mind. We don't want to just ask how you will secure your stuff, but also ask how you will secure their stuff. And what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes we get so focused on securing our network that we forget that many of these devices that are connecting to our network are going to leave our network. So when it comes to wireless security, we have to think about securing our wireless network, but also securing our wireless devices. So do you give an iPhone to your employees? Do you give a tablet to your employees? Do you give a laptop to your employees? Do they take those devices out and connect them to hotspots and other wireless networks other than your network? We have to think about securing the clients on and off the network. And that obviously means having some of those traditional things in place we've thought about even in the wired era, and that is good malware, anti-malware software, and possibly special software that's focused on protecting that client as a wireless client. So you can put client software onto the device that'll help protect it against peer-to-peer attacks when they're at hotspots and things of that sort. You may even consider implementing some solution that enforces the use of encryption. Even though the hotspot connection may not be encrypted, there's another layer, a VPN layer of encryption whenever they're connected to a hotspot. So these kinds of things have to be considered as well. And then, of course, securing the network and its resources is also important. So we have to think about both sides of this coin when we're dealing with wireless security, because we may have significant enterprise data sitting on a laptop computer that then goes out and connects to a hotspot, potentially making that data vulnerable. And therefore, thinking about encryption containers on the device, these types of things to help protect that information can be key in the whole big picture of security in relation to our wireless devices and our wireless network. Now, one of the key modern security solutions then is CCMP AES, and when it's implemented in the enterprise form, we call that WPA2 Enterprise. When you're dealing with this, you have three components in the puzzle, as we see here from this diagram illustrating 802.1x EAP authentication. We have the supplicant, the authenticator, and the authentication server. The supplicant is your wireless client. So this could be a tablet, an iPhone, or an Android phone. It could be a laptop. It could be a desktop computer, but it's a supplicant. It's a wireless client. The authenticator is the AP or the thing that does the operations of the AP. It could be a controller, for example. So the authenticator is the AP or controller or something of that sort. And then the authentication server, most typically, is a radius server that you're accessing on the back end. So these three components need to be in place. And there's something that's key here. The supplicant and the authentication server are going to need to support a shared and acceptable EAP type that you're using within your organization. So if it's a radius server and it is anything modern at all, it's going to support a few key EAP types like EAP TLS, PEEP. Those are probably going to be supported. But are those the types you want to support? Do you want to use EAP TLS? Then you have to make sure your authentication server supports that. In addition to the authentication server, the supplicant has to support it. Now, this is not always constrained to just what the device supports out of the box. That may be a more common way of thinking with tablets or phones. But with a laptop, you can obviously replace the supplicant. And even in some cases with tablets and other mobile devices, you can put alternative supplicants on the device to allow it to use other EAP types. The key is to find EAP types that give you the security that you need and that are supported by your clients. A big key factor in selecting an EAP type is whether or not certificates are going to be required on the client. If certificates are going to be required on the client, like with EAP TLS, for example, in most implementations, you're going to need to think about how you're going to provide for those certificates, because now it's more than just a certificate for the radius server. You need a certificate for each and every one of your clients. So that means a public key infrastructure in your environment. Now, it is important to know when you're thinking about security, and just because I'm using this slide, I'll address the issue. You'll notice that at the bottom here it says the 802.1x controlled port is still blocked. Well, that is because this diagram is at a very high level illustrating the 802.1x EAP process without focusing on any specific EAP type. At the end of that process, when you've had EAP success, you still do not have the encryption keys that you're going to use for communications on the wireless network. At the point of EAP success, you have been authenticated and all the materials are available that are needed to generate the encryption keys. But the key factor here is that the controlled port is still blocked. You're still not able to pass standard networking traffic because you have to do the four-way handshake, okay? So after 802.1x EAP is successful, you have a four-way handshake. Think of it like if you're using WPA2 personal, you have a passphrase, right? Well, after that passphrase is validated as accurate, then you have the four-way handshake with that. In the same way with WPA2 Enterprise, after you go through all the 802.1x EAP authentication process and you have an EAP success message from the authenticator, then you still have to go through the four-way handshake just between the supplicant and authenticator. The authentication server is out of the picture now. And that four-way handshake is what's going to generate your unicast encryption keys so that the AP and the client can talk and everything's encrypted privately just between them. And it's also what's going to exchange the group encryption key that is used for multicast or broadcast traffic down to the clients. So very important to understand that, and I'm addressing it for the simple reason that I don't want you confused by that little box that we have down here in the bottom. So when it comes to choosing an authentication server, remember this is your radius server, right? When you're selecting an authentication server, it's going to be driven by needs and not vendor preference, meaning that the vendor you've used for your infrastructure may not provide an authentication server that meets your needs. It may be that you have Microsoft servers all throughout your environment, but maybe the Microsoft Radius server does not meet your needs. So choosing an authentication server for 802.1x EAP authentication is driven by answering a few key questions. First of all, does it support the required EAP types? So you've chosen an EAP type that you know your clients support, or the supplicants you can place on those clients support it. But does the Radius server that maybe you already have available to you support it? If not, you might have to choose a different solution. Does it integrate with your infrastructure? And here, a big second question that helps with this is, does it support external databases like directory services? So are you going to have to completely recreate all of your client devices or user accounts in the Radius server, or does it integrate with your infrastructure, your external database, so that you can utilize it? Another important question, does it scale? So are you able to either build a hierarchy or distribution of these Radius servers throughout your space, so that, for example, remote locations are not necessarily required to come back across the WAN links in order to perform their authentication? Now, you may want that for some reason, but you may also want failover. So you have to think about the scalability of the authentication server solution. And of course, I'm always real world, so this question always has to come up. Does it fit within my budget? So if I've got two choices and one is wonderfully ideal and the other meets my actual needs, the one that's wonderfully ideal is twice as much, I may not have the budget for it. That's just the real world. So I have to address that as well. Now, when it comes to configuring Radius, we have a great screenshot here from mrncciew.com, which is a great blog with lots of valuable information about wireless LAN operations, how it works, configuration processes, and so forth. He's one of our CWNEs. You see here the basic process of configuring Radius in a wireless LAN controller or an AP, and this kind of reveals some of the things that are in play here. So first of all, there's a shared secret. This is to establish the link between the authenticator and the authentication server, or the Radius server. So that shared secret, don't confuse that with a pre-shared key used on the wireless side or something like that. This is just for the link between the access point or controller and the Radius server. And then there are port numbers. Now, the normal port for Radius is 1812. You might have adjusted or changed that. Sometimes you can modify that. You can also decide whether a server is just configured or if it's configured and enabled for use. You can have backup servers in most configuration environments. And then you can also have server timeout variables and things like this. But the key factor here to note is that when you're setting it up, you're going to have a shared secret that's configured on the Radius server and on the authenticator. And you're going to need to know the port number of the Radius server and, of course, the IP address of the Radius server. All of this in order to configure it appropriately for utilization. Once this is set up, this link is set up between the authenticator, which again is your AP or controller, and the Radius server. You've actually got everything in place you need. You just need to make sure that the Radius server on the back end has some way to look up these users and these clients, that it has some way to implement the proper EAP type that the client is going to use, and then the Radius server, through the authenticator, can negotiate with the client the actual EAP authentication process. Now, again, I mentioned that GCMP is available. This is the Galois counter mode protocol, and it is specified in 802.11ad, and it is supported in 802.11ac as well. So it's part of the 802.11 standard as a whole, but it was first implemented in 802.11ad as an amendment. It still uses 128-bit AES keys, and it uses a PN or a packet number to provide variation to the encryption process. And this packet number is 48 bits long, and we can't reuse it with the same temporal key. This works a lot like WEP with the problem of reuse with initialization vectors, right? The temporal key is generated during the establishment of the session between the AP and the client station. So this is your PTK that is built in the four-way handshake. Now, some of the key benefits of GCMP. First of all, GCMP is different than CCMP in that when it's doing AES, it does one operation per block for encryption. CCMP with AES does two operations. So immediately we have a significant increase in efficiency here. You can see why this can be beneficial for the future as we move toward a gigabit per second or more, possibly passing through APs as we get into the future. Then we need something that's very efficient and less intensive on the CPU. That's one benefit in that it only needs one process per block. But another benefit of GCMP is that it can run in parallel. So AES has to run in sequence because the next block depends on information from the previous block. And then the next block after that depends on information from the previous block before it. And so we must encrypt the blocks in sequence. This is not the case with GCMP. GCMP can encrypt each block independently and therefore multiple blocks in parallel. So not only do we have only one process per block, but we can be working on the encryption of multiple blocks in parallel, both of these giving us more efficiency and more speed in the encryption process. Now, the reality of the world we're in right now is that the lack of client station support, like all 802.11n and earlier devices, will continue to prevent widespread use of GCMP for some time. We've got to get a saturation of devices to where we could actually utilize this in order to get the benefits that it has to offer us. Now, the final major topic we want to talk about in today's presentation is monitoring solutions. And first of all, the question, why monitor? Well, we can do it to conduct security audits and locate vulnerabilities in the environment. So we're validating that we've actually implemented our network in the secure manner that we desire. To maintain regulatory compliance and have reports that show that we're complying with any types of regulatory constraints upon us. Think things like HIPAA, PCI DSS, and so forth. And we can also do it to maintain proper performance levels. So monitoring systems can show you information about security, but they could also give you reports related to the performance of your environment. And also to verify network availability, make sure our uptime is in compliance with our service level agreements. And then what monitoring tools would we use? Well, you've got wireless intrusion detection and prevention systems. And remember, the difference there is a detection system will simply alert you that there may be a potential problem, whereas a prevention system may take action, like trying to contain a rogue access point or something like that. We also have dedicated monitoring solutions, which not only monitor for security issues, but also performance issues and so on. We have manual processes with protocol analyzer software and hardware and spectrum analyzer software and hardware. And then, of course, we have hardware sensors as well that might be used with some type of an overlay solution. So with an integrated monitoring system, whether it's a WIPS solution or a general monitoring solution that also includes security, is simply going to take advantage of the APs. And so the APs are going to act as both access points and sensors, meaning that in most cases they'll go off channel maybe for a few milliseconds or up to 100 milliseconds or so, and they'll scan as sensors, and then they'll come back and service the network as access points. So this is something that is often done. The problem, of course, is you might miss an issue that occurred if you're only scanning, say, less than 5% of the time, and it is obviously going to have to degrade to some level the performance of the wireless network. But this is very common because many vendors have them integrated. Some vendors will recommend installing more APs than you actually demand in order for the off-channel scanning to not degrade your performance as far as what your needs are, your service level agreement demands. An overlay solution is a little different. With an overlay solution, we have separate dedicated sensors. These sensors, usually not as many of them as access points, but they can be distributed not only near where the APs are, but also further from the APs and near where the clients are. These sensors can report on performance as well as security issues, and so they are a very appealing solution to a person that wants the best performance they can get out of their network and also wants to be able to monitor for security problems as well as performance problems. Organizations like Nyansa, 7Signal, and others offer sensor-based environments or integrated solutions as well. And the benefit, again, of an overlay like this is that you have dedicated devices. Now, keep in mind, you can do an overlay type implementation with many vendor solutions that are integrative, because what you can do is actually have APs that are dedicated to being sensors rather than going off channel. So you're still using the integrated solution, but you're dedicating APs to be sensors. The benefit of that is if there are peak times when you need more throughput, capacity, etc., then you could switch some of the sensors over to being APs to get that, and then you could switch them back to being sensors at later times. That's one potential beneficial scenario. Think areas like conference facilities, things like that. But in addition, if you have the budget, you can also just implement the dedicated APs to be full-time sensors. Now that's what we had scheduled to cover. We're going to go into a Q&A period here in a moment, but before we do, I want to make sure I note for you, watch the CWNP TV YouTube channel. We're going to be setting up a demonstration video there related to the configuration of WPA2 Enterprise and 802.1x EAP. So walking you through the whole process of setting up the Radius server, configuring the AP to use the Radius server, and then connecting with a client to that infrastructure solution that is WPA2 Enterprise compatible. So we're going to walk through the whole process there in a separate video and post that online probably sometime late next week. So make sure you watch out for that.